Hey, Fame Campers. Welcome to day number 3, where we're talking all about the interview. I'm really excited to go over this subject because I think it's one of the coolest ways that you can get your story and your message out online and to get that brand awareness because it's coming from a space that's just a conversation. And we all love getting that conversation to be able to retain the information and really get to know someone on a personal level. Often I think we're a little bit afraid to go on interviews and to put ourselves out there to create our own fame because we're paralyzed that we don't know what to say. So today we're going to go over a few of the questions that you can prepare yourself for and also give you the confidence to know that many podcast hosts or many people on their YouTube channels actually don't expect you to be 100% prepped with the specific questions they're going to ask because they do want it to come across really authentic and conversational. So it goes back to just really having a sense of who you are as a leader in your industry, what message your brand wants to put out there, and then just going with the flow. I always think that you need to sit down and kind of journal this stuff out so that when it comes time to talk to the podcast host or the interviewer that you're speaking with, you don't have that kind of awkward first date feeling, right? That feeling of being like, oh my God, I have to be scripted exactly and know what to say. If you just have a general sense of what you're trying to put out there. And being a really engaged interview guest is kind of akin, and this is one of my favorite ways of describing it, is kind of akin to being a Boy Scout that teaches yoga. You have to be both prepared yet flexible. So it's like as if you were going to a dinner party and you didn't know anyone there. You're going to be a little bit bored at first. So this is step number 1, research your interviewer. If you're going on a podcast, go ahead and listen to the last 3 episodes of that podcast. Go ahead and find that podcast host's personal Twitter handle and read what they actually are putting out there. See if you can find them on LinkedIn to know a little bit about their background. This will give you the ability to be able to have some rapport with them and talk to them in a way that seems like you're having a really genuine and authentic conversation. And your podcast host is going to be so grateful that you did that because their audience is going to feel it. So if you really feel as if you're walking into the interview without knowing anything about your podcast host beforehand, your host is not going to be able to be as open as they would like to be and to have as fluid as a conversation. So I think this step is missed by a lot of people because you're focusing too much on the story that you want to tell without realizing, the host is there and they've created a community who is about to hear from you out of their background. So oftentimes they'll want to share and discuss this within the interview. So it's a huge way to differentiate yourself from people who are just going on podcasts in a selfish way versus going on there to have a conversation and to create that community to be even stronger. So appearing on a podcast as a guest is really kind of mutually beneficial if you look at it this way, right? Oftentimes, people who are interviewing, especially on podcasts, are doing so to get their own name out there too, because it's likely they know you are going to share that interview on your own feeds. So this, again, every single day in Fame Camp, I've gone over the fact that we need to make sure that we're building up our own Twitter feeds, we're building up our own LinkedIn connections and networking there, that we're growing our Facebook presence, because if you have a larger follower account on your accounts, it's more likely the podcast host, if they're choosing between 2 people to interview, they're going to probably want the one who has a larger audience because it's likely you will share that link once it goes out. If you don't, you certainly should. It's a great way to get more content out there on social media. And that puts their podcast in front of your audience, and you're obviously in front of the podcast audience by being the interviewee. So know that going into it, it's going to be a mutually beneficial arrangement and engagement between the 2 of you. So that means you should really enter it prepared to be able to talk to the host. So do your research, make sure you're continuing to build up your own followers online, network, DM people, especially on Twitter and LinkedIn. It is really a place you should be thinking about as a humongous networking event, especially these days when those aren't going on, right? So if you're building up your followers, it's much more likely the interviewer would pick you over someone else to interview because you'd be able to share that. So you really want to remember, going back to the actual interview steps, that it's just a conversation. I think sometimes, kind of like in job interviews, we forget how to like interact with people when we're so nervous. So I don't want you to think about the hundreds or millions of people who are going to be listening to the interview. Just have a conversation with that one person. Seems simple, seems like, Megan, you're wasting my time saying that. But when it comes down to getting into the actual interview, oftentimes we'll get so in our heads about that. So you really want to make sure that you sit down, have a conversation, and you're always going to win if you're sharing your truth, if you're sharing your story, and your mission will get out there much better if you're not super concerned with sticking to the script. It really does make this such a great way for you to kind of sneakily market. Not in a bad way when I say sneaky marketing, but I'll give you an example. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was by the CEO of Cabot Cheese. So they're a cheese brand based up in Vermont. And he was sharing that small farmers and co-ops are actually what make up the larger brand of Cabot Cheese, and how they're so helpful to the communities out there, so supportive of small businesses and small farmers, and how they're going to make sure that they're a sustainable company helping the environment, sharing their mission. He wasn't selling me the cheese at all. He wasn't selling me their dairy farms at all. All he was doing was talking about the mission that their company is based upon, making sure that they're being environmentally friendly, making sure that they're helping small businesses. And by the end of that podcast, you know what? I was ready to purchase their cheese from now on when I went to the store, because I felt like I aligned with the values he was sharing. So that's the true power of making sure when you're creating fame and going on other people's platforms like podcasts and on YouTube, of just truthfully sharing the mission, the origin story behind your company, what kind of values you want to produce out there. And that's the way of really marketing in a way that people don't feel like you're selling to them. You're just telling your story. It makes it so much easier on you if you have that in mind, that that's truly kind of the point of the interview. And really, when you're interviewing, you want to make sure that what you're saying is inspiring people to action. So don't just think about ways that you can get facts and statistics out there. We all have that information at our fingertips. You know, finding information and consuming information these days, there is a plethora of it out there, right? There's no shortage. What is a shortage is people taking action. So if you're someone like a coach, or if you're someone like a fitness instructor, if you can find a way in the interview to inspire people towards action through your stories and through your value, that's going to be the biggest bond and the biggest way that you can reach people listening to the interview and provide them with results. So within your stories, make sure that at the end, you have a way of reminding people to take action on the things you're talking about. If this goes back to that story I was telling about Cabot Cheese, you know, taking action would be me going to the store and purchasing that. So how could he weave that in? He could then just talk about the way, you know, of saying, taste how our cheese tastes better because it was made by small dairy farmers who aren't using any hormones, XYZ, next time you're at the store. Not super salesy in that sense at all. The interview questions just roll off the tongue in that way. So think how you can really inspire people towards action, and the podcast host, as well as the people listening, will really love the result that you're going to want to get for them. And if it comes from a genuine place, like again, going back to the cheese example, if you truly think it tastes the best and is the healthiest for you, saying something like that is helpful. We get so scared to sell sometimes, especially on interviews and especially on other people's platforms, because we don't want to come across as that used car salesman. But when we look at sales from the opposite direction of saying, this is a huge help and a huge benefit of me allowing people to know about this product and to know about the value of my service. And if they don't know about it, their pain point is going to persist. They're not going to get the life and the desired outcome that they want. So if we kind of flip it again, that you're helping people when you sell to them, and if you've done your research and know that the person interviewing has an audience base that's going to really be moved and really be helped by your product or service, it becomes way more fun to talk about it. It becomes you actually trying to help people, which means that you're bringing that joy and you're bringing that excitement into actually selling. Cool. So let's go back to actually kind of talking on the interview. You want to make sure that you're finding your own style. So it's all throughout this Fame Camp week, we've been giving you structures, we've been giving you kind of guidance on what to do, what steps to take. But really all this is just a framework, right? You want to make sure that to be an amazing guest, you have your own style and that you're not just copycatting additional guests who have been on the podcast before. I've heard a really good comparison to kind of how you find your own style that you can incorporate not only into interviewing, but into like your own brand guidelines, as akin to like clothing, right? So clothing, if you purchase pants, if you purchase shirt, that's kind of the framework, right? So there's a framework for getting a great interview done, and we'll go over some of that in a bit. But what really makes for that pizzazz, especially when you're interviewing, is having your own style. So the clothing metaphor expanded there would be just, people who get noticed and people who get written up in fashion magazines and stuff. It's how they're pairing these frameworks together. I know it's a little bit of a weird comparison, but it really works when you think about it for brand voice as well. There's frameworks out there. Everyone might be talking in your industry about similar concepts, teaching similar things, putting similar products out there like Coke and Pepsi, but it's that style and it's that brand voice, and it's what people think when they associate seeing your brand logo, what feelings they get. That's really going to be that differentiator of having you show up in that fashion magazine or just being seen as someone walking down the street in a pair of black pants and a white t-shirt, right? Cool. So how do you get this style, right? I think it's really about making sure that you remind yourself you have specific stories that no one else does. A great way of describing this is your mess is your message. I'm sure you've heard that before if you kind of follow a lot of online influencers, but I absolutely love this because I think so much of the time we're like, I don't have anything good to share. But if we think about what's been challenging in our life and what we've overcome, those are really great stories. Our brain loves that hero's journey. That's what a lot of movies are based on. That's what a lot of books are based on. The entertainment we already consume is based on this hero's journey. So that zero to hero aspect of, hey, I was struggling with this. I went through this tough time. These are the steps that I took. This is the outcome that I had. That narrative is weaved throughout everything that's entertaining content already. So why wouldn't you try to bring that in to your interviews? Because basically that's what podcasts are, right? You're competing against people's time that they could be watching Netflix or they could be on the phone with their best friend. If they are choosing to listen to an interview that you're giving them, you best be providing them some entertainment in there. I think that's a cool way of looking at anything that we do in marketing is this idea of, your content has a job to do and it is competing not only against other content in your industry, but it's competing against how people actually spend their time, again, reading a book, watching Netflix, or listening to your podcast. So remind yourself that you need to provide that value, but you need to do it in your unique style. So your mess is your message. Think about the stories that are really entertaining and think about how you can weave that hero's journey story of how you created your product or service or whatever you're talking to the podcast host about in that way. Have some stories prepared, but be flexible, not to have to use them all. Don't try to kind of cram them all into the interview, but make sure you have personal life stories prepared before going into any interview there. Most hosts really want to start with that sort of story and connection content. And I think, this is really because hosts want to build a relationship with you that their audience can feel. Listening to podcasts is one of the most intimate ways that you can get connected with an audience, right? They're doing things throughout their day like running, doing laundry, all that fun stuff, and they are having you in their ears. It's like having a conversation, and good podcast hosts know that. So they actually are thinking about questions that perhaps are in the minds of their listeners as you are speaking and asking those questions as if the listeners are asking them. So remind yourself that it's all about building relationships. It is really kind of a great way to look at this content, I think, is, there's relationship building platforms and there's traffic driving platforms. So the difference here is illustrated by things like, Twitter and Pinterest. Those are traffic driving platforms. It's a really great place to share links and to get people to click from the social network, drive traffic to your site, right? Whereas like podcasts and Instagram, those are much more so relationship building platforms, and both need to exist in your business. So that's one of the really great ways of getting this combination of being a guest and having a really powerful interview on someone's podcast is building that relationship, getting intimately into someone's ears as they're going throughout their day. So that's how you want to think about it when you're being interviewed. You're building a relationship with the listeners in that way. Don't be concerned about actually driving traffic to your site. Don't be concerned about that. Remember, this piece of content has a job to do, and that's to build relationships and build intimacy with your brand in there. Cool. So as you're thinking about this as well, I think it's cool, especially to remind yourself to have stories, because a lot of us think our content is kind of boring sometimes, mostly because we're consuming it all day long. We are really researching what's going on in our industry. And say you're someone who might do something like taxes. This is a question that we get here a lot at Meet Egger. I have a really dry subject matter like finance or taxes. How do I make it interesting on an interview or on social media? Well, that's by weaving your stories into it. So think about the ways that you can bring that personality into your interviews. Cool. So it's a really delicate mix to do all of this, right? To have these planned stories, to have these planned ideas, but to be flexible for the podcast host. So right now, I want to use some questions that I really like. These are actually from Tim Ferriss. And these are the 11 questions that he asks in one of his books to every single person. And I think these are a really good strategy for you to journal about. So these questions here, again, these aren't necessarily what your podcast host is going to ask you, but having kind of a framework of what you would answer for these makes it a lot easier. And if you've never been on a podcast before, these are the types of questions that really great podcast hosts would be asking. So I'm going to read them. There's 11 of them here. If one you don't have a really great answer to, write it down and do some journaling about it so you can come prepared to your next interview. All right, cool? All right, so here they are. Number 1, what is the book you've given most as a gift and why? Or what are the 1 to 3 books that have greatly influenced your life? Think about the books that have greatly influenced your life that you could go ahead and share on a podcast. Number 2, what purchase of $100 or less has most positively impacted your life in the last 6 months? There we go. So go ahead and think about what purchases have really influenced your life. Remember, those personal details are really connecting. Number 3, how has a failure or an apparent failure set you up later for success? And do you have a favorite failure of yours? This is a great one. Again, remember, your mess is your message, getting that pain out and making sure you're really helping be a mentor for people in the future, not to have to go through the same struggles you went through. And just kind of this idea that, hey, we're not perfect here. We all fail, and having that sort of camaraderie builds that relationship with people on the other side. Number 4, if you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, getting a message out to millions or billions, what would it say and why? This is a great one. Remember your why, as the email and Fame Camp today said, that Simon Sinek talk. This is kind of what goes into it. What's that one message you want to get out? It really helps get clarity and kind of zone in on things. Number 5, what is one of the best or most worthwhile investments you've ever made? Number 6, what is an unusual habit or an absurd thing that you love? Number 7, in the last 5 years, what is a new belief, behavior, or habit that has most improved your life? Number 8, what advice would you give to a smart-driven college student about to enter the real world? What advice should they ignore? Number 9, what are the bad recommendations that you hear in your profession or your area of expertise? Number 10, in the last 5 years, have you become better at saying no? What new realizations or approaches have helped you say no? And number 11, when you feel overwhelmed or unfocused, or you've lost your focus temporarily, what do you do? So if any of those questions hit home in the way that you're saying, oh my gosh, I wouldn't know how to answer that if someone talked to me about it, perhaps take out your journal and actually start to have these prepared ahead of time. I think it's incredibly helpful. Just again, it's not like the podcast host or the interviewer would actually go out and ask you these exact questions, but they are great at kind of doing a little introspection and having a mission-based outlook on how you could be really helpful. Cool. So make sure, again, that you go ahead and think about how to make answers to interview questions really relevant as well. So one way you can make things relevant, whether it's any marketing, is using something called the triangle of relevance. So what the triangle of relevance is it's taking what is a really great business interest for you, what is a really great interest to the person consuming this content, and weaving in some sort of time significance. So that's what makes up the triangle. Business interest for you, obviously getting clients, selling your product. what is in it for the actual person listening, so solving their pain point, and time significance, so something in the world. So when you're answering these questions, or like if you're giving away something at the end of the podcast, remember that you obviously are on there to get brand awareness. So talk about your mission, talk about your company, but make sure you're always thinking about who's listening, the audience, what the outcome they want in their life is, so that you can move them to action to get a result. And then if something's going on in the world, or if you're having some sort of collective experience, like especially right now with so much going on, make sure that you weave some of that into it as well, because that's what's resonating in people's lives. So don't talk about like a concert with 100,000 people at it right now when we can't get together in big groups. Make sure that you're making it really relevant to what people are experiencing in the moment, and your podcast listeners will be much more likely that they'll remember what you're saying. Cool. And at the end of most interviews, podcast hosts will typically ask if you have some free gift for their listeners. Oftentimes, this can be in the form of a discount code. Discount codes are great because then you can actually track the ROI of being on that interview much better. If you give a personal discount code just that's related to just that podcast, you can see, hey, did anyone purchase from that podcast? What's even better, I think, is you can give away a free gift and make like a special landing page for one of your lead magnets. And that way the podcast is helping to make sure that you're giving people value, but also collecting email addresses from it. So, we have stuff like our secret blogging formula, which is an ebook that we've made here at Meet Edgar that we can send people to. We can give the URL that people can go download that. Again, just getting a little bit more of the email list building into the interview. So just be prepared if that's something that you haven't created yet. Sit down and think about, if you were to distill all of the information that you have into a guide, a PDF guide, what would that look like? And go ahead and make one of those and ask the podcast host if you could perhaps share the URL or put the URL in the show notes where people could go ahead and download it in exchange for an email address. Just again, to always make sure you're looking for ways to build up your email list through these engagements. Cool. And just like things in a job interview, have some questions for the host as well. If you've done your research and you've really gotten out there and know some of the background behind that coach, you really want to make sure that you're asking the host questions during the interview. That can be a great way of having the host want to have you back because they like to talk and share their story so much with their community too. It's not going to work every time. Perhaps it's not going to be a conversation that they do want to engage in that way, but having them prepared can be really nice. Cool. Last few tips here, record yourself ahead of time. We all hate hearing our voice so much on recordings. Most of the time, that's because we're not used to it. So go ahead and record yourself and notice those little places that you say a lot, or if you have a certain tick and you say like a lot, just being aware of that can really help you cut it out so that you can be much more eloquent on the podcast. And just knowing these things, I always say, oh, great question, as a way of buying myself a little bit of time after someone's asked me a question on a podcast, right? You say, oh, that's a really great question. That sounds kind of weird if you say it after every single question they ask, right? So just make sure that you have some of those other phrases. So if you wanted to kind of mull over in your head, rather than saying, oh, that's a great question, what else could you say? And be aware if you kind of default to one thing. I say absolutely a lot after questions as well. So that's something I'm aware of because I've recorded myself and listened to it. And I really want to make sure that I cut that out so it doesn't sound super kind of structured. Again, it's a conversation. You don't want it to feel like you're talking down to people and you have a script memorized there. Cool. So guys, that was a lot. I know there is a download guide in the description of this video. Go ahead and grab that if you didn't. It's the same one from the email today. If you're in the Fame Camp emails, go ahead and grab that. If you do have other questions, definitely let me know. Chantal, you asked, the questions. Yeah, so actually, if you Google Chantal, Tim Ferriss 11 interview questions, it'll come right on up. Or if you just go ahead and email support@meetedgar.com, Chantal, I'll go ahead and send you those. But yeah, just email those questions, and those are really great. It's from, I think, his book, Tribe of Mentors. Those are the questions he asked to everyone in there. And I think they're excellent to journal on, like I said, to have those prepared for you. Cool, cool, cool. Thanks so much for hanging out today, guys. We will be back tomorrow with day 4 of Fame Camp, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.